The sun beat down on the stone pavement of the town square, hot and relentless. It was that kind of afternoon where the air shimmers just above the ground, and the smell of warm asphalt mixes with the exhaust from passing cars. In the center of the square, right near the old fountain that hadn't worked in years, sat an old piano. It wasn't a shiny new piano. It was a beat-up thing, chipped paint exposing the wood underneath. Some of the keys looked yellow and cracked. Most people walked past it without even looking. They were busy. They had phones in their hands, bags on their shoulders, and worried lines on their foreheads. But then there was him, the old man. Let's call him Arthur, though most people just called him that old guy or something worse, under their breath. Arthur was a mess of a person. He was thin, like a stick that had been left out in the weather too long. His hair was white and stuck out in every direction, as if he had just rolled out of bed. He wore a coat that was too big for him, a heavy wool thing that looked like it belonged in the winter even though it was summer. The coat was stained and there were holes in his pants. He looked like he didn't have a home, or if he did, it wasn't a place where anyone would want to live. Every day, at exactly noon, Arthur would shuffle toward that old piano. He didn't walk like other people. He dragged his feet, making a scratching sound on the stones. He would sit down on the bench, which groaned under his weight, stare at the keys for a long time. People knew what was coming. It was the same routine every single day. The locals who worked in the nearby shops would roll their eyes. Tourists would look at him with curiosity, maybe ready to take a picture, thinking they were about to see a street performer. But Arthur wasn't a performer in the way they hoped. He took his hands out of his pockets. They were shaking. His fingers were twisted, his knuckles swollen and big. It looked like it hurt him just to hold them up. And then he started to play. It wasn't music. Not really. It was noise. Loud, banging noise. His fists would come down on the low keys, thud, thud, thud. Then he would hit the high keys with his palm. Slap, slap, slap. Sometimes he would press a group of keys down and just hold them, letting the piano scream out a discordant sound that made your teeth hurt. It sounded like a machine breaking down. It sounded like a train wreck in slow motion. There was no rhythm. There was no melody. It was just anger and confusion poured out into sound. A young woman pushing a stroller jumped when the first loud bang rang out. She covered her baby's ears with her hands and quickened her pace, glaring at Arthur as she passed. Seriously again? She muttered to herself. A group of teenagers sitting on the edge of the fountain stopped their conversation. One of them, a boy with a skateboard, laughed. "He's at it again," he said, nudging his friend. "Sounds like he's killing the thing." "It's terrible," his friend replied, plugging his headphones into his ears to block it out. "Why does the city let him do this?" But Arthur didn't seem to hear them. His eyes were squeezed shut tight. He was sweating in his heavy coat, beads of water rolling down his dirty forehead and dripping onto the piano keys. He grunted with effort every time he slammed his hands down. "Just asterisk, huh? Huh." He looked like he was fighting an invisible enemy. His face turned red, then purple. He looked angry, but if you looked really closely, past the dirt and the crazy hair, you could see tears mixing with the sweat. He was crying, but nobody looked that closely. They just saw the noise. They just saw the crazy old man ruining the peace and quiet of their lunch break. A man in a sharp gray suit, carrying a leather briefcase, was walking past. He looked important, like he was late for a meeting. The noise of the piano made him stop. He put his fingers in his ears and walked around the piano stand to get a better look at the source of the disturbance. He saw Arthur there, thrashing at the keys. The man in the suit frowned deeply. He pulled his fingers out of his ears and leaned in. "Hey!" he shouted over the noise. "Hey, old man." Arthur didn't stop. He hit the keys harder, as if trying to drown the man out. A low, rumbling bass note vibrated through the ground. "You are making a terrible racket," the man yelled. He looked around at the other people looking for support. "Nobody wants to hear this garbage. It's the middle of the day. Have some respect." Arthur paused for a split second. He opened one wet eye and looked at the man. For a moment, the noise stopped. The square went silent. The man in the suit thought he had one. He thought the old man was going to pack up and leave. But Arthur just let out a loud, sobbing gasp, like a fish out of water, and then he smashed his elbow onto the keys, creating a dissonant crash that echoed off the brick buildings. The man in the suit threw his hands up in the air. "You are crazy," he shouted. "Absolutely out of your mind." He shook his head in disgust. He looked at the few people who had stopped to watch. "Why does anyone put up with this?" he asked them. "He's just a nuisance." "He's a menace to the public," no one answered. The teenagers looked away. The mother with the stroller was already halfway down the block. The man in the suit realized he was fighting a battle alone, but his anger was too high to just walk away quietly. "You should be ashamed of yourself," the man spat at Arthur. He leaned in closer, his face red. "We walk past you every day. We give you space. We try to be nice, but you just scream with your hands. You are broken." Arthur didn't look at him this time. He just kept hitting the keys. Bang, scrape, thud. The sounds were jagged. They hurt to listen to. It was like listening to a person scream without opening their mouth. "I'm done with this," the man in the suit said, straightening his tie. "And I'm not the only one. Everyone thinks you are crazy. Everyone walks away from you because you offer nothing but noise." The man turned on his heel. He started walking away fast, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the pavement. He wanted to get as far away from the piano as possible. As he walked, he could still hear the banging. It followed him. It was annoying. It was aggravating. It made him angry that someone could be so selfish, so unaware of the world around them. "Good riddance," the man whispered to himself as he disappeared into the crowd of people coming out of the subway station. Back at the piano, Arthur was alone again. Well, not entirely alone. There were still people passing, but they gave him a wide berth. It was like he had a force field of bad vibes around him. If you walked too close, you might catch the crazy. A young couple, holding hands, approached. They were smiling, laughing at a joke the boy had just told. Then they heard the piano. The girl winced. She squeezed the boy's hand. "What is that?" she whispered. "Just ignore it," the boy said, steering her toward the other side of the path. "Just some old guy. He's harmless, but let's not get too close." They walked past quickly, their eyes fixed on the shops across the street, refusing to look at the old man in the heavy coat. They treated him like a crack in the sidewalk, something you step over because you have to, not because you want to. The sun moved across the sky. The shadow of the lamppost moved slowly, inching its way toward Arthur's feet. But he didn't move. He didn't take a break. His hands were swollen now, red from the impact. Every time he hit a key, a jolt of pain shot up his wrist. But he welcomed it. The pain was real. The noise was real. In his head, things were quiet. Too quiet. That was the problem. In the real world, the world where everyone else lived, he was making a horrible scene. He was a nuisance. He was the man they called crazy. But inside his mind, he wasn't banging random notes. He was trying to talk. He was trying to talk to her. He remembered how she used to tap, her fingers on the table when she was nervous. Tap, tap, tap. He remembered the sound of her heartbeat in the quiet hospital room. Thump, thump. The noise he made on the piano was an imitation of life. It was a messy attempt to keep the rhythm of a world that had stopped for him years ago. But looking at him from the outside, nobody saw that. They just saw a dirty old man screaming at a piano. By 1 o'clock, the crowd thinned out a little. The lunch rush was over. The people who worked in the offices were back at their desks. The tourists were in museums or cafes. The square was mostly empty, save for a few pigeons pecking at crumbs near a trash can. Arthur was tired. His arms felt like lead weights. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He looked down at the keys. The low C key was sticking again. He had to hit it 3 times to make it sound. He hit it once. Nothing. He hit it again. A dull thud. He hit it a 3rd time, and the sound rang out, deep and low like a bell. He rested his hands on his knees. He looked up at the sky. The blue was so bright it hurt his eyes. He wiped his face with his sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across his cheek. Across the square, a shopkeeper was standing in his doorway. He was sweeping the stoop, but he was really watching Arthur. The shopkeeper had seen the man every day for 3 years. He had seen the people yell. He had seen the people laugh. He had seen the police come once to tell him to keep it down, though they never arrested him. They just looked at him with pity and told him to go home, wherever that was. The shopkeeper shook his head slowly. He leaned on his broom. "Why do you do it, old-timer?" He whispered to the empty air. "Why do you torture everyone like that?" Arthur didn't hear the whisper. He was too busy listening to the silence in his head. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the hot city air. He could smell hot dogs from a cart down the street. He could smell car exhaust. He could smell the dust. It wasn't the smell he wanted. He wanted to smell lavender. He wanted to smell soup simmering on a stove. He lifted his hands again. They were trembling so bad now that he couldn't straighten his fingers. They looked like claws. He positioned them over the keys. He didn't want to play. He was so tired. But if he stopped, the silence would win. And the silence was the scariest thing of all. So he started to bang again. Clink, clatter, bang. It was a fresh assault on the ears. A dog tied to a bench whimpered and tucked its tail under its body. A woman walking by with headphones visibly winced and turned the volume up on her device, shooting a dark look at Arthur as she scurried past. Arthur didn't notice. He was lost. He was lost in the noise, screaming out his grief to a world that had already decided to walk away. To them, he was just the crazy piano player. But to him, he was the only one left who was still listening. Asterisk, most people look at a piano and see a way to make music. They see black and white keys that, when pressed in the right order, can make you feel happy or sad. They hear melodies. They hear songs. But Arthur didn't see it that way. To Arthur, the piano wasn't an instrument for a song. It was a machine. It was a tool he used to try and build a bridge to a ghost. If you could look inside Arthur's head while his hands were flying across those keys, you wouldn't hear the chaotic banging that the tourists heard. You wouldn't hear the dissonant noise that made the businessman cover his ears. Inside Arthur's mind, it was organized. It was a specific language. Every loud crash on the low keys was a word. Every sharp scrape on the high keys was a question. The world thought he had lost his mind, but Arthur was just trying to have a conversation. He was thinking about her. He was always thinking about her. Her name was Martha. They had been married for almost 50 years. She was the kind of woman who smelled like flour and sugar because she loved to bake. Even when the arthritis in her hands made it painful. She had a laugh that sounded like birds chattering in the morning. But the last 5 years of her life were hard. They were very hard. Martha got sick. It wasn't a sickness you could fix with medicine or surgery. It was a sickness that took her away piece by piece. First, she forgot where she put her keys. Then she forgot how to get home from the grocery store. Then she started forgetting Arthur. That was the worst part. She would look at him with eyes that were full of fear, asking who this strange old man was in her house. He had to put her in a home. It broke his heart to do it, but he couldn't take care of her anymore. She needed doctors and nurses. She needed a special bed and safety rails. So he visited her every single day. He would sit by her bedside and hold her hand, trying to find the woman he loved inside the confused shell she had become. Arthur discovered something strange about her condition during those long visits. The doctors called it sensory seeking. Basically, Martha's brain was dying, and in its death throes, it craved strong input. Soft things made her nervous. If you spoke to her in a quiet, gentle voice, she would pull away. If you played soft music on the radio, she would cover her ears and moan. One afternoon, nurse dropped a metal tray on the floor. Clang. It was a loud, jarring noise. Arthur jumped, expecting Martha to be scared. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. She looked at the spot on the floor where the tray had landed and let out a happy sigh. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Arthur was confused. "Yes, honey." It was loud. "Did it scare you?" "No," she said, her eyes clearing for just a moment. "It felt real. Everything else is so fuzzy. But that was sharp. I like it. That was the turning point." Arthur started to experiment. He realized that the soft, gentle world of lullabies and love songs was gone for her. That world didn't exist anymore. She lived in a world of hard edges and loud sounds. So, he started making noise for her. He would tap on the metal railing of her bed with a spoon. Tap, tap, tap! He would bang on the plastic table with his fist. Thud, thud, thud. When he did this, she would relax. Her breathing would slow down. The panic in her eyes would fade away. The rhythm gave her something to hold on to. It anchored her to the earth when her brain was trying to float away into nothingness. He spent 2 years tapping on things. He tapped on walls. He tapped on windows. He tapped on books. Then, one day, he passed by a music store that was going out of business. There was an old beat-up piano in the window with a sign that said cheap. He looked at his hands. They were rough and strong, even if his back was weak. He bought the piano with the little bit of money he had saved up. He didn't buy it to play Moonlight Sonata. He didn't buy it to play jazz. He bought it because he realized he could make so many more sounds with a piano than he could with a spoon. He could make low rumbles that felt like thunder. He could make high shrieks that felt like a whistle. He could make a whole storm of noise if he wanted to. He dragged that piano to the center of the town square. Why did he choose the square? Because he wanted her to hear him. He didn't know if she could hear him from the nursing home miles away. He didn't know how sound traveled in the spiritual world, but he had a feeling that if he made enough noise, if he put enough energy into the sound, it would reach her. He sat on that bench every day. He played his songs for her. To everyone else, it sounded like a child hitting random keys. But to Arthur, it was a poem. The heavy left hand was him saying, "I am here." Martha. The sharp right hand was him saying, "Don't go." Martha. The dissonant chords were the chaos of her mind. And he was trying to play along with it, so she wouldn't be lonely. He remembered the last time he saw her. It was a Tuesday, raining heavily outside the window. She was lying in the bed, looking so small under the blankets. Her eyes were closed and her chest was barely moving. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The quiet felt heavy, like a blanket of snow that buried everything. Arthur reached under the bed and pulled out a small wooden block and a stick. He had brought them from home. He started to tap. Tap, tap, tap. A slow, steady beat. Martha's eyes opened just a little bit. She didn't look at him. She didn't know who he was. But she heard the sound. Her fingers moved slightly on top of the blanket, tapping along with him. Tap, tap, tap. "It's okay," Arthur whispered, tears running down his face. "I'm making the noise. I'm here." She took one last breath and let it out slowly. Her hands stopped tapping. The room went silent. She was gone. That was 6 months ago. The nursing home took her body away, and Arthur was left alone in the quiet. He went back to his empty house and he couldn't stand it. The silence was screaming at him. It was driving him crazy. So, he did the only thing that made sense. He went back to the piano. He played harder now. He played louder. Maybe if he played loud enough, he could wake her up. Maybe if he made a big enough racket, the universe would notice and send her back to him, even just for a minute. People didn't understand this. They walked by and saw a dirty old man abusing a public piano. They saw a nuisance. They judged his clothes and his hair and the smell that hung around him. They didn't know that under that heavy coat, right next to his heart, he kept a small folded piece of paper. It was a note the nurse had written him on the day Martha died. It said, "She waited for you. She listened for you." Arthur played the piano to honor that note. He played to keep the promise that he would always make noise for her so she would never be lost in the silence again. The pain in his swollen knuckles was nothing compared to the pain in his chest. The sun started to dip lower in the sky. The shadows grew long and stretched across the square like fingers reaching for his feet. Arthur didn't stop. His stamina was incredible. He played like a man possessed. A police officer on a bicycle slowly rode by. He didn't stop Arthur. He just watched for a moment, shaking his head. The officer knew the story. He had heard it from the shopkeepers. It was sad, sure, but it was also a public disturbance. Technically, he should ticket him. But the officer looked at Arthur's face, the intense concentration. The tears streaming down the dusty cheek sand he'd just pedaled away. Some things are more important than noise ordinances. Arthur hit a particularly discordant chord, a clash of notes that sounded like a car crash. He held it down, letting the strings vibrate until the sound turned into a rattle. He closed his eyes. In the darkness of his mind, he saw her. She was young again. She was wearing the yellow dress she wore on their first date. She wasn't scared. She was dancing. She was dancing to his terrible, loud, beautiful noise. "Can you hear it, Martha?" He thought. "I'm still playing. I'm still here." He opened his eyes. The square was empty. The people were gone. The pigeons had flown away. It was just him and the piano. He looked at his hands. They were bleeding a little bit on the knuckles. He wiped them on his pants. It didn't matter. The pain was real. The blood was real. He took a deep breath and lifted his hands for the next verse. He didn't care what they called him. They could call him crazy. They could call him a fool. They could walk away and shake their heads. It didn't matter. As long as he played, he wasn't just a crazy old man on a bench. He was a husband talking to his wife, and that was the most important thing in the world. He lowered his hands and struck the keys again, sending a new wave of noise crashing against the walls of the city. The days in the city tend to blend together after a while. One Tuesday looks pretty much the same as the next, especially when you are stuck in a routine. But this particular Tuesday felt different. It was heavier. The air was thick with moisture. Not quite rain, but a wet blanket that made it hard to breathe. The sky was a dull, static gray, pressing down on the tops of the buildings. It was the kind of weather that makes your bones ache. For Arthur, the ache was worse than usual. He woke up in the small, quiet room he rented above a laundromat. The silence there was absolute. No machines were running early in the morning, and the neighbors were still asleep. It was the kind of silence that used to scare Martha. He remembered how she would hum to herself just to fill the empty air. He reached out to the side of the bed, his hand patting the cold sheet. It was a habit he couldn't break. But of course, nobody was there. Just the imprint of his own body from the night before. He got up slowly. His joints popped and cracked as he stood. He washed his face in the small sink, looking at himself in the mirror. The face staring back looked older than he felt. The eyes were tired, redrimmed from lack of sleep. He pulled on his heavy coat. It smelled stale, like it always did, but he didn't mind. It felt like armor. The walk to the square was harder today. His legs felt like lead pipes. Usually the walk gave him energy. He would think about the song he was going to play, imagining the rhythm in his head. But today, his mind was blank. The internal soundtrack, the chaotic beat that usually drove him forward, was faint and distant. When he arrived at the square, the piano was waiting for him. It looked sad in the gray light. The dust on the keys was thicker than usual. Nobody had touched it since he left the day before. Arthur sat down on the bench. The wood was hard and unforgiving. Usually, he would sit down and immediately launch into his performance. He would bang the keys to announce his presence. But today, his hands hovered over the ivory keys. They just hung there in the air, trembling. He looked around. The square was busy, as always. People were rushing to work, clutching coffee cups like they were lifelines. A few street performers were setting up near the subway entrance a juggler and a woman playing a violin. The violinist was playing a soft, classical tune. It drifted over to Arthur. It was beautiful. It was everything his playing was not. It was smooth, melodic, and correct. The notes followed the rules. They went where they were supposed to go. Arthur listened to the violin. He closed his eyes for a second. In his mind, he saw Martha again. He saw her sitting in the garden of the nursing home, her hands resting on her lap. He remembered bringing a radio once. He had put on a station that played smooth jazz, thinking it would calm her down. She had hated it, he remembered clearly. She had started to cry. Not a sad cry, but a scared cry. She had pulled at her hair, rocking back and forth. "Too soft," she had whimpered. "It's not there. I can't grab it." Turned off the radio immediately. He started tapping on the metal arm of her wheelchair. Clack, clack, clack. She stopped crying. She grabbed his wrist. There, she said. That's better. Arthur opened his eyes. He looked at his hands resting on the silent piano keys. The violin music wafted through the air again. It was nice. It was normal. It was the kind of music people wanted to hear. It was the kind of music that made you stop and put $1 in a case. But it wasn't for Martha. Martha was gone. The noise he made, the banging and the clashing, was for her. It was a language they invented together in the dark, dusty rooms of the hospital. He looked at the people walking past. A young woman in a business suit stopped to tie her shoe near the piano. She glanced at him, then looked away quickly, checking her watch. She didn't know that he was a husband. She just saw a dirty old man taking up space. A thought crept into Arthur's head. A quiet, cold thought. Maybe she is truly gone now. Not just her body, but the part of her that needed him. The part of her that needed the noise. For 10 years, he had fought her disease with sound. He had beaten against the walls of her confusion like a drummer in a marching band. But now the battle was over. She had surrendered. She had let go. If he played today, who was he playing to? The air, the pigeons? The people who hated him? He looked down at the low C key, the one that was stuck. He pressed it gently. It didn't make a sound. He pressed it harder. A dull thud. It felt ridiculous. Here he was, a grown man, sitting in the middle of a busy city in a winter coat in the middle of summer, about to make a fool of himself. He remembered what the man in the suit had shouted the day before. You are crazy. Arthur looked at his reflection in the shop window across the street. The man didn't look like a hero. He didn't look like a devoted husband. He looked exactly like the man in the suit said. He looked pathetic. His hands were starting to hurt just from hovering. The arthritis was flaring up in his wrists, a sharp, shooting pain that went all the way to his elbows. He was so tired. He was tired of being misunderstood. He was tired of the heat and the noise of the city and the pitying looks. But mostly, he was just tired of being alone. He thought about the ritual. The banging was how he talked to her. Thump thump. I love you. Scrape scream. I miss you. Crash. I'm still here. But if nobody was listening, was he really saying anything? Or was he just making noise for the sake of noise? He watched a group of school children walk by. They were laughing and shouting, happy to be out of the classroom. They pointed at him. Look at the piano, man. One shouted, play us a song. Arthur didn't move. He couldn't. Come on. The kid yelled, throwing a small pebble. It bounced off the side of the piano with a ping. Play something loud. The teacher shushed the child and hurried them along. But the seed was planted. Arthur felt a wave of shame wash over him. He wasn't a street performer. He wasn't an entertainer. He was just a man who couldn't let go. The silence of the piano under his fingers was deafening. For the first time in 10 years, the silence felt heavy enough to crush him. He realized that he had been using the noise to keep the silence away. He was afraid that if it got too quiet, he would have to admit that she was never coming back. And now, sitting in the oppressive heat, under the gray sky, he couldn't find the strength to fight the silence anymore. He dropped his hands into his lap. They lay there, limp and lifeless. He looked at the fountain. It was dry. The statue in the middle was missing an arm. It looked broken, just like he felt. He sat there for 20 minutes. Half an hour. An hour people walked around him. The path went around the piano bench. A stream of humanity flowing past the rock in the river. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked if he was okay. To them, he was just part of the scenery, like a lamppost or a trash can. Arthur closed his eyes. He took a deep breath, inhaling the smell of exhaust fumes and old pretzels. It wasn't the smell of lavender and baking bread. It was the smell of the world without her. He felt the tears coming, but he didn't wipe them away. He let them run down his cheeks, tracking through the dirt on his face. He felt empty. The fire that made him bang the keys, the anger and the love that drove his fingers had burned itself out. There was nothing left but ash. He sat perfectly still. Even the pigeons lost interest in him and waddled away to find someone who would drop crumbs. Arthur was just a man on a bench. The crazy piano player had stopped, and in the quiet of the city square, with the hum of traffic and the distant sound of a violin, he finally let himself be lonely. The heat in the square was getting worse as the afternoon wore on. The air was thick and sticky, making it hard to breathe. The few people who were still outside moved slowly, trying to stay in the patches of shade offered by the tall buildings. Arthur just sat on the piano bench, staring at his hands. They were resting in his lap, motionless. For the first time in years, the piano was silent. The keys sat still, waiting for a punishment that wasn't coming. A young mother and her little girl walked past the fountain. The little girl was holding a melting ice cream cone, and her face was sticky and happy. As they got closer to the piano, the girl slowed down. She was used to the noise. She was used to the old man scaring her with the loud crashes every day. She instinctively pulled her mother's hand, preparing to run past the danger zone. But there was no noise today. The old man was just sitting there, like a statue. The little girl stopped. She tilted her head to the side, looking at Arthur with big, curious eyes. She licked a drip of ice cream that was running down her fingers. "Mommy," she asked, her voice small. "Is he sleeping?" The mother looked down, distracted by her phone. She glanced at Arthur, then gently pulled on her daughter's arm. "Come on, sweetie. Let him be. We don't want to bother him." The girl looked back one last time, her eyes wide with wonder, before being dragged away toward the subway entrance. That simple question, asterisk, "Is he sleeping?" Asterisk, hit Arthur like a physical blow. It punched through the fog in his brain. Was he sleeping? No, he wasn't sleeping. But was he living? He felt like a ghost. He felt like he had been haunting this square for 10 years. Rattling his chains and screaming at people who couldn't see him. He looked down at the piano keys again. They were dirty. Some of them had little chips missing. He saw the cracks between the keys where crumbs and dust had gathered. He had spent so much time trying to make noise that he had forgotten how to look at the instrument. In his mind, the image of the woman playing the violin came back. He thought about the music she made. It was gentle. It was smooth. He thought about Martha. He thought about the years before she got sick. He remembered a night a long time ago, maybe 40 years ago. They were in a small apartment, just starting their life together. Money was tight. The heating was broken. It was freezing cold outside, and the windows were rattling in the wind. They were huddled together under a blanket on the couch. Martha was humming. She had a beautiful voice, soft and sweet, but she was too shy to sing out loud. She was humming a song she had heard on the radio. It was a sad, slow song, but it made Arthur feel warm inside. "Play it for me," she had whispered. "I don't know that song," Arthur had said. He wasn't a musician then, either. He just knew a few chords. "Just play something that sounds like how I feel," she said. So he had played. He didn't bang. He didn't crash. He had pressed the keys gently, trying to find the notes that matched the sound of the rain on the window and the warmth of her hand in his. It wasn't perfect. He made mistakes. But it was theirs. It was a love song. That was the song she loved. Not the noise. Not the chaos. The chaos was for the sickness. The sickness made her hate the soft music because it reminded her of what she was losing. But the sickness was gone now. She was at peace. Arthur realized something. The monster that took her away, the confusion that scared her, was dead. He didn't need to fight it anymore. He had spent 10 years shouting at a ghost that had already left the room. He looked at his reflection in the shop window again. He saw the crazy coat. He saw the wild hair. He saw the fear in his own eyes. He didn't want to be that man anymore. He didn't want to be the crazy piano man that people walked around. He just wanted to be Arthur. He wanted to be the man who loved Martha. He took a deep breath. His chest hurt. His heart was beating fast. It felt scary to stop. The noise was a shield. As long as he was making noise, he didn't have to think about the quiet life ahead of him. But the quiet was here now. He had to face it. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, but not from the cold. They were shaking because he was about to do something that felt impossible. He was about to play a real song. The song came back to him. It was simple. A melody by a composer named Debussy. He didn't know the fancy name of the piece, he just knew how it went. He knew it by heart. He felt a tear roll down his cheek, hot and fast. It landed on the back of his hand. He didn't wipe it away. He let it sit there, cooling his skin. "I'm done fighting," he whispered. He wasn't talking to the people on the street. He was talking to her. "I'm just going to play now, Martha. Just for you." He lifted his hands. They felt heavy, like lead weights. But as he hovered them over the keys, he felt a strange lightness in his chest. A weight was being lifted off his shoulders. He wasn't the town nuisance anymore. He wasn't the crazy old man. He was a husband saying goodbye. He placed his fingers on the keys. He didn't make a fist. He didn't bang. He gently rested his fingertips on the white notes. He found the starting position. His left hand found a low, deep note. His right hand found a soft, high note. The silence in the square stretched out for one more second. The cars honked in the distance. A siren wailed far away. But right here, right in front of the piano, the world was holding its breath. Arthur pressed down. The sound that came out wasn't a crash. It wasn't a scream. It was a chord. A soft, clear, major chord. It rang out pure and clean, cutting through the humid air like a knife. It sounded like the first breath of fresh air after being stuck in a smoky room. He held the chord. He let it vibrate. He closed his eyes. He saw the apartment again. He felt the warmth of the blanket. He smelled Martha's perfume. He wasn't in the square anymore. He was back home. Slowly, carefully, his right hand moved. It found the next note. Then the next. A melody began to form. It was the clair de lune. This was the light of the moon. His fingers were stiff and rusty. They didn't move as fast as they used to. He missed a note here and there, hitting a sour key by accident. But he didn't stop. He didn't panic. He just kept playing. The mistakes didn't matter. The feeling behind the notes was true. The sound was hesitant at first, like a baby deer walking on ice. But as he played, the notes started to flow together. The music floated up from the strings and drifted out over the pavement. It was sad, incredibly sad, but it was beautiful. It was the sound of a heart breaking open. Arthur opened his eyes for a moment and looked at the people walking by. He didn't see them as enemies anymore. They were just people. People like him. People who had loves and losses. He wasn't angry at them for not understanding. He was just sharing his moment with them. The music swelled. His left hand played a rolling rhythm, gentle like ocean waves. His right hand played the melody, singing without words. It was a conversation with the past. It was an apology to Martha for the noise, and a promise to remember her with peace now. The sun was starting to go down behind the buildings. A golden light hit the side of the piano, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. For the first time in a decade, the piano looked like a beautiful instrument, not a machine of war. Arthur's shoulders dropped. The tension left his body. The heavy coat didn't feel like armor anymore. It was just a coat. He was just an old man playing a piano on a Tuesday afternoon. And for the first time in 10 years, he wasn't crazy. He was just Arthur, and he was finally letting her go. The melody that floated from the old piano didn't just hit people's ears. It seemed to reach right inside their chests and grab hold of their hearts. It wasn't loud like the banging had been. It was soft, but it carried. The notes of Clair de Lune drifted through the heavy, sticky air of the square, weaving through the sound of traffic and the hum of the city. It was like a cool breeze on a hot day. A young businessman, the same one who had shouted at Arthur just a day before, was walking out of a coffee shop. He had a cup in one hand and his phone in the other, yelling at someone about a missed deadline. The stress was pouring out of him. Then the music reached him. It was so different from the chaotic noise of the city that it made him stop in mid-sentence. He lowered his phone. The anger on his face melted away, replaced by a look of total confusion. He looked around for the source of the sound, expecting a street performer with a violin or a fancy keyboard. When his eyes landed on the old piano, he couldn't believe it. He saw the dirty coat, the wild hair, the trembling hands. It was the same man he had called a nuisance. but the sound coming from the instrument was heartbreakingly beautiful. The businessman stood frozen on the sidewalk, his coffee forgotten. He watched the old man's hands, expecting him to start banging again at any second, but he didn't. The music kept flowing, sad and pure. Near the fountain, a group of teenagers who had been laughing and joking fell silent. One of them was leaning against the stone wall, scrolling through videos on his phone. He took his headphones off. The music was better than anything he was listening to. He nudged his friend, pointed at the piano, and they both just watched. They didn't make fun of him. They didn't laugh. For the first time in their young lives, they were seeing an old man not as a weirdo, but as someone who had lived a whole life before them. The radius of the silence grew. People who were walking fast to get home slowed down. People who were looking at their phones put them in their pockets. It was like a spell had been cast over the corner of the square. The piano created a bubble of quiet around it. Arthur didn't notice any of this. His eyes were closed tight, squeezed shut to keep the tears in. He wasn't seeing the people. He was seeing Martha. He was seeing her face clearly, without the fog of the sickness. He saw her smiling at him from the kitchen of their old house. He saw the way the sun hit her hair when they walked in the park. He played the song for her, the version of her that existed before the pain. He was playing the lullaby he should have played for her 10 years ago. His fingers, stiff and swollen, moved with a grace that surprised him. They found the keys by memory, by instinct. Sometimes a finger slipped, hitting a sour note or missing a key entirely, but it didn't matter. The imperfections made it real. It sounded human. It sounded like someone trying their best, even when they were broken. The song reached a gentle climax, the notes rising up like a bird taking flight, then slowly floating back down to earth. The sound vibrated through the wooden bench and into Arthur's bones. It felt like a release. Every time he hit a key, he was letting go of a little bit of the pain he had been carrying. He was letting go of the guilt of not being able to save her. He was letting go of the anger at the world for ignoring him. The woman with the stroller from earlier walked by again. She had her baby in her arms now. She stopped rocking the baby and listened. The baby stopped fussing and stared at the piano, mesmerized by the gentle sounds. The mother looked at Arthur's face. She saw the tears washing tracks through the dust on his cheeks. She suddenly understood. This wasn't a show. This was a goodbye. She felt a lump form in her own throat, her eyes stinging. She didn't know this man's story, but she felt his grief. It was a universal language. Everyone knows what it feels like to lose something you love. The sun dipped below the buildings, casting long shadows across the square. The air turned a deep orange color. It illuminated Arthur and the piano like a spotlight from heaven. The chipped paint on the piano looked golden. The dust motes, dancing in the light, looked like magic. Arthur's hands began to slow down. He was reaching the end of the piece. The rhythm became softer, slower. His breathing was deep and ragged. He was exhausted, but he felt lighter than he had in years. The heavy coat didn't feel like a burden anymore. The crazy thoughts that buzzed in his head were quiet. He played the final chord. He didn't smash it. He pressed the 3 keys gently, holding them down, letting the sound ring out and slowly fade into the air. Ding! Hume! He sat there, his hands resting on the keys, listening to the sound die away. He waited for the silence to come back and scare him, but it didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was peaceful. It was the kind of silence you feel in a forest or a church. It was full. For a long moment, nobody in the square moved. The businessman held his breath. The teenagers stood still. The mother held her baby close. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. It didn't feel like a concert. It felt like they had just witnessed something sacred, something private. To clap would have broken the spell. Arthur opened his eyes. He blinked in the fading light. He looked around, dazed, as if he was waking up from a long dream. He saw the people standing there. He saw the businessman with his mouth slightly open. He saw the teenagers looking at him with respect. He saw the mother wiping a tear from her eye. For years, it looked at him like he was invisible, or like a problem to be fixed. Now they were looking at him like a human being. The shame he had felt earlier, the feeling of being ridiculous, was gone. He realized that he didn't need their permission to grieve, but it felt nice to finally be understood. He wasn't the crazy piano man anymore. He was just a man who loved his wife very much. Slowly, Arthur lifted his hands off the keys. He pulled them into the sleeves of his coat. He wiped his face with the rough wool, drying his tears. He took a shaky breath and stood up. His knees popped, but he stood tall. He looked down at the piano one last time, patting the side of it gently, like an old friend. "Good night, Martha," he whispered softly. He turned away from the bench. He didn't shuffle. He didn't drag his feet. He walked slowly, but with purpose. He walked toward the edge of the square. As he passed the businessman, the man stepped aside and nodded his head. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. It was an apology. It was a sign of respect. Arthur gave a small, tired nod back. He walked past the teenagers. They didn't snicker. They just watched him go with quiet awe. He walked out of the square and into the streets of the city. The noise of the traffic rushed back in the honking, the sirens, the talking, but it didn't bother Arthur anymore. He had his own music inside him now. The square stayed quiet for a long time after he left. The empty piano sat on the sidewalk, the keys still reflecting the orange light of the sunset. The people eventually started to move again, resuming their lives. But they were different. They walked a little slower. They looked at each other a little kinder, and Arthur, walking home in his heavy coat, felt a warmth in his heart that hadn't been there for 10 years. He was finally ready to go home and rest. The song was over, but the love would play forever.